Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tipperary Studies for our November lecture in the Tipperary People and Places series. Tonight, our speaker is Professor Salvador of St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, and his subject, a very timely one for the month of November, Death and the Irish, some historical and cultural reflections. So I hope you enjoy the evening, and I wish to welcome Salvador to speak.
So, good evening everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Source in Thurles once again, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you tonight. It's not often that a chief mourner's car loses the hearse, but that's precisely what happened to me on a summer evening in 2003. My uncle Sean had passed away in Nina Hospital, and it was the occasion of his removal from the hospital mortuary to St. Joseph's Church in Donegal, where he'd lived with my mother for a number of years. Now, everything was fine as the cortege pulled out of the gates of the hospital and turned right in the direction of the town. I followed the hearse closely as I chatted to family members about some of the people who had come to sympathise and the exchanges we had had. Now, in order to understand what happened next, one needs to know a little of the geography of Nina itself, which I'm sure a lot of you do. If I were leaving the hospital in Nina for Donegal on a normal day, having turned right out of the hospital, I would continue straight to a small roundabout at Nina railway station, and at that point, instinctively, I would swing right down by Joey O'Connor's Nina Shopping Centre, or what used to be Joey's, and out onto the Dublin Road, after which I would literally be on the home straight. So, travelling a matter of a few feet behind the hearse, while engaged in some lively conversation, we made our way down to the roundabout, and as usual I swung right and I made for the Dublin Road, at which point I stopped suddenly, mid-sentence, and inwardly gasped, "Where's the hearse?" It was gone. There was no sign of it. I looked behind me through the rear-view mirror. Vanished, too, was the cortege of sympathisers' cars. Where was everybody? We were suddenly alone and feeling very foolish indeed. What had happened? How is it even possible for a chief mourner's car to lose the hearse? Panic set in. What would we do? Of course, what I hadn't realised at the time was that it was customary for funeral processions to make their way up through Nina town centre, so that when the hearse reached that roundabout at the railway station, it didn't take the shortcut to the Dublin Road as I had done, but instead it continued straight ahead through the town. Now, when this realisation dawned on me, it was a matter of turning left at the Dublin Road and driving back into the town to meet the funeral head on, and then to swing in behind it once more. Now, I've tried not to consider what the long line of sympathisers thought of all of this. What I do know is that it left us, the morning party, knowing how much Sean would have relished the incident, shaking with laughter all the way to Donegal Church, when only the slow, sombre ringing of the church bell called us to compose ourselves lest we scandalise the whole village. Even in the midst of the sorrow of loss, humour is often to be found. Death is funny like that. Now, I've always been fascinated by death and its rituals. One of my earliest memories is of reciting each night before going to sleep the prayer, "As I lay down my head to sleep, I pray to God my soul to keep, and if I die before I wake, I pray to God my soul to take." Even from my youngest years then, the prospect of one's eventual demise, sooner or later, had clearly impressed itself upon me. Of course, growing up in a rural Irish village in Donegal in County Offaly, such as I did, the experience of visiting the houses of bereaved neighbours, viewing the deceased, joining in the communal prayers, and offering one's sympathy to family members and relatives was a constant. It was simply what close-knit communities did. Not only did this give me an appreciation of the communal nature of Irish rituals surrounding death, but it also played a significant part in normalising death as an integral part of life. For a young, impressionable child, the sight of seemingly interminable crowds of people descending on a dwelling house for the removal, locals and those from further afield, filing their way into the room in which the deceased person had been laid out, offering their condolences to the bereaved, touching the hands of the corpse, rosary beads entwined around ice-cold fingers, kissing the person's brow. All of these things were deeply formative for me. And then there were the casual remarks, such as, Jesus, she looks herself. What age would she be in? Or, he's in a better place now. Sure, you wouldn't want him to be still suffering. Or again, Jesus, he looks fierce young looking. See how the pain has gone out of his face. And maybe later, in reporting on what had been seen, God, she was a lovely corpse. There was usually a hushed silence or some respectful whispers in the room in which the person was laid out. However, one could always clearly hear, by contrast, loud guffaws of laughter and merriment coming from other rooms, such as the kitchen or sometimes bedrooms which had been cleared for the occasion. These were the sounds of people reminiscing on the life of the deceased, or of meeting relatives and friends whom they hadn't seen since the last funeral, while downing multiple cups of tea, glasses of whiskey or brandy, and the invariably rich fare of sandwiches and homemade baking, which were furnished in endless supply by members of the community who approached each funeral as a challenge to make sure that no one went hungry. Go on, eat up! Should it only be left? We have 16 more apple tarts to rot in the stomach. The cacophony would only subside when a firm shh was passed along the human chain, all the way from the sitting room in which the deceased lay, through the hallway and into the kitchen. It would take a little time for the din to drop, but when it did, one could glean the reason. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for sinners now and in the hour of our death. Amen. The rosary had begun. Each decade customarily recited by a different member of the family, but not always. Sometimes, with little or no prearrangement, the giving out of the decade was left to the spontaneity of the individuals in the room. As soon as one decade ended, another would be automatically picked up, relay-like, and the rosary runner would set off again at breakneck speed. Rosaries at removals were never ponderous affairs. There was something innately understood about pressing on. Sometimes this was a very practical consideration, as a family member might not have recited these prayers in a while, or an account of emotion, or the overwhelming nature of the occasion. They might experience a bout of nerves, which propel them to try to reach the end of the prayer as fast as possible at each utterance. Meanwhile, the chain of responders to the rosary wound itself through the house and out both doors, front and back, those outside often adding their mumbling voices to the sound of crows cawing in the nearby trees. The repetition of the Hail Marys became mantra-like, as the uproarious chatter of the house was now profoundly stilled and focused. It's an experience that is impossible to adequately put into words, but one which, once observed, can be utterly moving and even deeply consoling. It's here too, in the homes of the people, that one soon began to hear of strange and wonderful folk beliefs, customs and rituals associated with the process of death and dying. I've stood in houses where a family were waiting for their loved one to die and have heard one of the family members report having been suddenly woken in the middle of the night by the sound of 3 knocks on the front door of the house, when in fact there was no one there. This didn't need to be explained to many people in rural Ireland. It was relatively well known that these 3 knocks heralded the death of someone in the family. And it was taken from this that their loved one's passing was now very near. This warning didn't come to all, of course. It was said that the 3 knocks only followed certain families. Likewise, in the day or two before a person's death, it was often reported that they claimed to see other family members, people who had passed on before them, return to the room. This was yet another sign that death was not far off. When it did eventually occur, it was customary in some households to immediately stop any clocks in the room. Now, as school children growing up in Moneygall in the 1980s, attending funerals in the parish was simply something that one could not avoid. This was particularly the case when our primary school principal, the headmaster, the late Paddy Maher, was also director of the church choir. Consequently, whenever there was a funeral mass, usually at 11 a.m, we 5th and 6th class pupils would file down to make up the choir, along with some of the regular parishioners. Paddy, who was nearing the end of his teaching career at the time, introduced us to a wealth of liturgical music, including Gregorian chant, which had long faded from the repertoire of other local choirs. The plaintive sound of the Requiem or the eternal rest grant unto him, and let perpetual light shine upon him, as intoned by Paddy, remains with me to this day. That, coupled with the use of incense at funeral masses and the poignancy of the rites which were particular to requiem masses, such as the final commendation and farewell over the coffin. May the angels lead you into paradise. May the martyrs come to welcome you and take you to the holy city, the new and eternal Jerusalem. May choirs of angels welcome you and lead you to the bosom of Abraham. And where Lazarus is poor no longer, may you find eternal rest. Words like these left a deep impression on me. For me, funerals and the rituals surrounding them were, for the most part, occasions of quiet reflection, even occasions of deep calm. Their familiarity and the heightened interconnectedness of a tightly knit community which they prompted even made them occasions of no little solace. There was even some consolation to be had from burials that had to take place under the pouring rain. The older generations got around such inconveniences not simply with resignation, but indeed with hope. Happy is the corpse that the rain falls on, indicating that the individual in question would surely attain eternal life. Now, familiarity is an important concept here. Because of the close-knit nature of many Irish communities and their vigorously enduring traditions surrounding death, which seem to persist even as other traditions fade, the Irish have gained a reputation for exhibiting a certain easiness around death, or indeed of doing death well. Its familiarity sometimes elicits a certain matter-of-factness in those, even in the dying, who just want to get on with it. The story is told of the old Irish woman who was approaching death, and her family having gathered around her, it was suggested that some prayers for the dying be recited. The first daughter took up the prayer book and began to read the prayers aloud. But after a line or two, she broke down into sobs and couldn't continue. The second daughter immediately took up the mantle and began to read the prayer from where her sister had trailed off. But she likewise soon got a lump in her throat. The tears flowed, and the prayers remained unfinished. Their mother, their dying mother, who hadn't yet slipped into unconsciousness, was becoming more and more agitated. And at this second lapse into lachrymosity, she slowly raised herself from the bed, and snatching the prayer book from her daughter's hand, she says, "You may give it over to me here. I'll say them myself." But even when the Irish aren't dying, they're dying. Gillian O'Brien, who has recently brought out a fabulous book on the Irish obsession with death and dark history, recalls how her grandmother, whenever she'd be asked how she was, would reply, "Yara, dying away, girl," even when she was in perfect health. Older generations of parishioners displayed an even greater familiarity with the community of the dead, whose existence often overlapped with the living. As a teenager, I remember very vividly spending hours upon hours listening to a wonderful lady called Nora Rice share her seemingly inexhaustible store of local knowledge, folklore, and lived experience with me. Nora, who was in her 80s at that time, was a natural storyteller and had superb powers of recall. She also had a deep appreciation for local traditions and customs which were no longer observed. It was from Nora that I first heard that the lighted candles kept at a dying person's bedside were often kept afterwards, after the person died, as there was believed to be a cure in them. Nora also related to me her own memories of customs concerning the dead, which were observed on the night of All Souls. And this is what she said. "On All Souls' night, you'd light your candles and put them round the fire, and you'd sweep the floor, and you'd get the holy water, and you'd put it on the table, put a glass of water beside it. And the old people used to believe that that was one day all the dead was let out. And everyone used to come to their own home, and you'd show them welcome. And you'd have 6 candles lighting for the poor souls round the fire, and the floor swam clean, and you'd kneel down and say your rosary, and you'd go to bed, and you'd leave the candles lighting. It was a lovely thing, and you wouldn't be seen out that night. Nobody would be seen out. You'd be afraid, because that was one night the Almighty made for the dead. And the old people used to say, always do your business in the daytime. My father used to always say that, Lord mercy. Go for your messages and do your messages. The day is for the living, the night is for the dead. And always when you're walking, you couldn't do it today though, walk on the middle of the road, because the poor souls was out walking as well as you. Take the middle of the road in case you might upset a poor old soul. I think that our traditional canon of rituals surrounding death have played a huge part in how comfortable the Irish have been in dealing with death as a culture, and by and large, particularly still in rural areas, how comfortable we continue to be with it as a part of life. In this facet of Irish life, it seems to me that change has been less rapid than in other areas, up until, of course, very recently, and of course, who knows where we'll be after that. Undoubtedly, traditional belief has played a huge role in how we've approached death over the centuries, and some of our most beautiful music and literature surrounding death draws from this very deep well. I think immediately of the Irish practice of keening over a dead loved one. Angela Burke has noted how the keener played a hugely important social role in speaking to the dead person on behalf of the living community. It was traditional, for instance, for the keener even to reproach the deceased, to ask why he died, to demand that he get up and come home. The keener then often voiced the labyrinth of emotions of the grieving family at times when they might have had the physical strength to do it for themselves. The keen was sometimes connected to the lament of the Virgin Mary over her dead son. And Irish folklore sometimes attributes the advent of the Cuine or the Keen to Mary herself. This would give rise to a very rich repository of cuinte, or laments of the Virgin Mary in the Irish tradition. Laments such as Shock no Loss, the Maidin and Willie. Ancedo las the Maidin, nor adori But faith wasn't always experienced as consolation, and we haven't always gotten the language right. Church authorities often condemned the rawness of emotion exhibited by keeners. For instance, Kerry storyteller Peg Sayers, in her reminiscences of funerals on the Blasket Islands, once recalled a scream of mourning, which she said went back and forth through my heart as though a knitting needle had been stuck into my ear. And yet, sometimes what the church offered in return wasn't always wise. My own grandmother, I'm told, was censured, was criticised by a priest in the 1940s for mourning the death of her 14-year-old daughter who had just passed away from an asthma attack. What are you crying for, woman? Isn't your child in heaven? Now, just as in the example of my grandmother, it's recorded in verse in one of the Irish-speaking areas of the country that a woman was admonished by a priest officiating at her son's funeral for lamenting him. And she was told that she should accept the will of God. And she replied, Eish the harbor the Shasta Dirach, lay the platforms yoid Dilas, near Hugshe three roha, in Immel the Chriad, non name Linadier of Udatiad. Wished priest, and stand up straight, read the Mass and you'll get paid. He didn't spend 9 months next to your heart, or 19 years round your house. It's not uncommon, even still, for well-meaning individuals at funerals to comfort the bereaved with words such as, sure God takes the best ones early, or sure God must have wanted him or her in heaven, as if God was somehow starved of company somewhere up in the clouds, and this required him to call yet another human being to himself. Most problematic of all, perhaps, are are the supposedly comforting words offered to the grieving parents of a deceased child. "Shall you have a little angel in heaven?" One suspects that most parents in this terrible position would so much rather have a little devil at home. The wake often takes centre stage in popular portrayals of death rituals among the Irish. The corpse laid out and placed on a flat surface, either on top of a table in full view or in a coffin without the lid. A plate or bowl of tobacco would often be placed on the corpse itself, the particular area of the corpse being subject to regional variation. The plate of tobacco would be passed around during the wake and returned to the corpse when not in use. A clay pipe filled with tobacco would be given to each man present, or else one was refilled and passed around. Often the pipes would be kept in a skin or a wicker basket. Snuff would be inhaled through the nostril and a plate of snuff passed around. Women would often take a pinch for the dead, and men smoke a pipe while blessing themselves saying, "May the Lord have mercy on them, may the Lord have mercy on them." In some places, in fact, the clay pipe itself was actually referred to as a Lord of mercy. There was a special type of clay pipe used for wakes, which was white in colour, with a long shank about a foot long, and a small bowl that didn't take too much tobacco to fill. Tobacco and clay pipes were often placed in the coffin and buried with the corpse, or cut tobacco would be scattered over the corpse before the lid was placed on the coffin. On occasion, new pipes would be produced and would be smoked in the graveyard before the grave was dug, and any unused pipes were placed in topsoil along with white stones. Any snuff that remained after a wake was often kept as a cure for headache. Now, while Sir Walter Raleigh is commonly credited with introducing tobacco to Europe in 1548, having discovered the plant in North America, Irish folklore presents us with a different story, a different version of events, tracing the origin of its use much further back in time. The following story was collected in County Antrim. I heard this story from my own mother, and she was a great one for believing in tobacco as a great cure for things. Now, she used to say that nobody ever should find fault with tobacco, for the Blessed Virgin herself was the first person on earth to smoke it. For it happened that after our Lord had been placed in the tomb, after having been taken down from the cross, there was none of the disciples there, for the simple reason they might have been afeard or something. Anyway, on Easter Sunday morning, someone of the disciples was going to the tomb to pay his respects to his Lord and Master. And it happened that he met the Blessed Virgin Mary, and lo and behold, hadn't she a kind of a thing in her mouth, and there was a reek coming from it. So the Blessed Virgin told the disciple the Lord had risen from the dead, as he promised on the third day after his death on the cross. So the disciple asked her why she was reeking at the mouth, and she replied that she found a weed grown inside the tomb of her Lord, and that there was an angel there. And this angel told her that she was to roll it up and light it, and to puff it, for it would help her. So she obeyed the angel anyway, and that was why she was smoking. And the disciple asked her what was the name of it, and she said it was called tomb tobacco, just because it was found grown in our Lord's tomb. And it should never be called tobacco, but always tobacco. Of course, a time would come where the need for quick burial of the dead would make customs as wakes impractical. The period of the Great Hunger, the Great Famine in Ireland, was one in which quick mass burials were commonplace, and owing to the weak condition of the population, the greatest fear of many was that of being buried alive. And yet, even in the face of such an awful prospect, those who told tales about this period somehow managed to imbue them also with no small degree of black humour. Two examples will suffice to make the point. Firstly, a story again from Irish folklore collected in County Roscommon. Collected from a Nora Connor as part of the school's collection in 1937-38. So this story was collected from Nora Connor, who was 86 years of age at the time. And it depicts the common situation in which many corpses had to be buried all at once during the period of the famine. And the story goes as follows. She said, on one occasion, the doctor pronounced sentence of death on so many that the man who was burying them was hustling all the corpses into a mat. When, as the corpses were piled high, when this one man spoke in a weak voice and said, I'm not dead yet. 'Tis no matter, says the man in charge. The doctor said you are. And he bundled all the way and he buried them. Another story, again from the school's collection, 1937-38, and related by Mr. Hugh Gilbride from Kinawley in County Fermanagh, ran as follows. An old woman, Mrs. James McGuire, was 16 years of age in 1847. She took ill and she was apparently dead. That evening the body was being conveyed to the graveyard. Halfway there she recovered and she sat up, and she lived a long, healthy life till 1917. And at her burial in that year, in 1917, an old man who remembered the former incident said, she'll hardly come back this time, will she? Now, other stories from the famine period purported to offer an explanation for customs surrounding death which survived long beyond the mid-19th century. One account from County Galway explains one response to the fear of being press-ganged into contact with the dead as the origin of a funeral custom that still survives in some areas to this day. And the story goes as follows. The people used not have any help to bring a corpse to the graveyard. When they would get tired, they would go into a house to see if there was anyone that could help them. When the people of the houses would see a funeral coming, they would close the doors and put the blinds in the windows so that the people who would be carrying the corpse wouldn't go in for anyone to help them. Even to this day, the doors are shut and the blinds put in the windows while the funeral is passing. I want to now move on to talk about the phenomenon of funeral offerings. And here, again, I'm drawing on the work of the late Frank Sweeney, who also wrote in The Death of the Irish volume. During the famine, the bishops in the province of Armagh decided that priests would take responsibility for the burial of the poor within its jurisdiction, and that offerings would be collected to cover their expenses. The practice was often defended by arguments that the region was poor and the poverty of so many Catholics rendered it impossible for the church to survive on voluntary contributions alone. Each diocese had its own system of collection. Normally, a table was placed outside the altar rails and the congregation laid their offering on the table while the undertaker or the priest called out the name of the person and the amount paid. In some dioceses, such as in Raphoe, in Donegal area, the offerings were collected in the home of the deceased during the wake. A person sat prominently beside the coffin in the house with a copybook and pen, marking the offerings paid for by each person. At the funeral mass, the marker stood prominently at the chapel door to record any late offerings from people who hadn't attended the wake. Towards the end of the funeral mass, the priest would call out the offerings paid by each person from the altar. Finally, the total sum collected would be announced. He would often pass comment on the derogatory amounts paid by some people and made his displeasure very well known from the altar. And it was known that people were visited by the priests if they continued to pay miserly amounts. parish, and the clergy had managed over the years to get the people to look on offerings as a mark of respect by neighbours towards the family. The more money paid, the greater the respect. When word was received that a person was dead, the first thing to be done was to take down the offerings book and scan it to see how much that family had paid at the wake in your house. If they had belittled you, well then such an insult could be addressed. It was a practice between the families and the clergy where it never seemed to be part of it. Now there's one story still told in Donegal about a frustrated priest in the early years of the 20th century who was struggling hard to raise the payment of offerings by his parishioners without great success. At one funeral, he was reading out the names. Michael Sweeney, shopkeeper, 2 shillings. James Boyle, 1 shilling. Mary Duffy, 6pence. John O'Donnell, 6pence. Michael Sharkey, 6pence. That's 14 of you that only paid 6pence. In God's name in this day and age. Alexander Robertson, £1. Did you hear all that? Did you hear that? Alexander Robertson paid £1. And him a Protestant. God, I wish the whole lot of us were Protestants. Now, the payment of offerings could become a great burden on the poor, and it was a cause of great stress in many households, but also other sectors. Teachers, publicans, and shopkeepers were often subject to none too subtle reminders from local clergy that they should be paying more. It's little surprise then that stories circulated which drew attention once again to long-standing historical complaints regarding the greed of clergy. One in particular, a story from County Kerry, which has St. Patrick as the main protagonist, will serve as a good example. Well, Patrick is watching a hurling match. He spots a pagan passing by the road, and he proceeds to ask him if he'd be baptized. Well, after some time, the old man relents, and he consents to baptism, after which he immediately dies. Though this would have been regarded as a great grace, preserving him from any future sin that would sully his newly cleansed soul. As his soul flew like a bird to heaven, his clothes and his bones fell in a heap on the ground, along with a big purse of gold and silver. Patrick, satisfied, went on his way, but soon after he turned back to take some coins from the man's purse. When our Lord later challenged him on this, he admitted he'd taken a little money, I suppose you could call it, I suppose a sacramental fee. And this led our Lord to declare that, the mind for the money would follow the priests ever after. So again, they'll trace it back to Patrick. Sometimes the variations trace it to Columkill or St. Paul or St. Peter. There's a variety of stories. When I was doing the book on Death in the Irish, one of the most enriching contributions to the volume came from Nell and Michael McDonough. And it was on traveller rituals, death rituals among the travellers. And Nell and Michael McDonough provided huge insight into how travellers approach death. And I want to give you a little flavour of that in their own words. As soon as anyone hears of a traveller being seriously ill or near death, all those who know him It's our way of showing respect. There could have been arguments in the family, and it's a time for coming together. It's the height of respect to visit someone who's dying. If you don't come at that time, it is noticed. People will travel long journeys, and the word gets round so quickly. When you come, you pray together. It's a time for bridges to be built. Death is as much part of your life as living. So it's very important to come and talk, a time to say things you hadn't a chance to say. No matter what happened before, if you come, you're made welcome, and it's noted. We understand how hospitals can't cope with our ways of this. We need to come, and usually it means a large crowd could be with the dying person. On the other hand, if we don't go, we're being extremely disrespectful, and the consequences are great. We insult the family if we don't go. There will be implications in the wider family by not turning up, and so we'd always find a way to make the journey. To be able to let them know that you care before they die is vital. We'd have a saying, you come into the world on your own, we don't want you to leave on your own. We know that hearing is the last sense to go, and so we whisper words into the ear of the person dying. We want the person to go to God knowing that they were at peace. So this time is important. Therefore, you'll often hear travellers pray that they will not die suddenly. That would mean there'd be no goodbyes, no last words that need to be spoken before death. If someone dies suddenly, there are massive consequences. Did he or she want to say something? Or was there something we needed to say to him or her? That's why after sudden death there's this strong keening by the graveside. The words unspoken up to then or before death are said in the keening. We always pray that there be a time for a last conversation. Now, there are different traditions in different families. If the person is near death, that person is often put into a private room in the hospital because of the crowds that gather. We stand at each side of the bed, but never at the foot of the bed. This is to allow the person to go directly from us to God. We're like a guard of honour at the side of the bed. The practices at the moment of death differ with age. It's an honour to be with an older person who has lived life. It's important that the person knows we're all there. We don't call the person back, but we let him or her go to God. When it's the death of a child, the grief is overwhelming. For an elderly person, we ask that the Lord have mercy on them, or the light and glory of heaven come. We never say that to a child. We say, God speed the child, go quickly to God's hands. There will be a lot of emotion at a traveller funeral. Women will tear their hair out. There will be other expressions of grief at the graveside. Now, travellers find it hard to understand country people, that is, settled people, when they express their emotions. If you don't express grief, then you're being disrespectful. Death is such a loss in the tightly knit family. Fasting is important during a time of grief. While their country neighbours are being kind and bringing food, travellers, in fact, prefer to fast during the time of death and funeral. So there's no makeup, no new clothes. We can hear the voices of people asking, why are you dressing up? Why are you brushing your hair and fixing yourself up? Sometimes it appears like country people are going to a wedding at the time of a funeral. At the graveside, you'd have to clean your shoes before leaving the grave and not bring the soil from the grave with you. Expectant mothers are not allowed into the cemetery. It's something to do with not carrying a child yet to be born into a place where there's death. People often wonder about the headstones we put up over our dead. We see it as our last act of kindness. It's our way of saying that our loved one has found a permanent place in this earth. It's our way of allowing them to say, I've made me mark. I was here on earth. Since we're a nomadic people, we're not usually associated with any one place. For example, country or settled people have places and things named after them. Even villages and towns can be named after them. Just and so with travellers. So when a headstone is put up, the traveller is saying, I was part of this community. I existed. And I was valued among my own. Now I'm visible in a world where I was invisible when I was alive. People travel long distances to the funerals, and indeed to the once mined and to the patrons. At the patron, we'd visit all the graves of our dead, and we never ask, where is he or she buried? We say instead, where is he or she camped now? It's a way of keeping them close to us in our thoughts. We never say goodbye in our conversations. For example, we say good luck to a child going to school. Good luck implies that we look forward to seeing you later. When we say goodbye to a person, it means they're not coming back. We only say goodbye at the deathbed. The origin of the word goodbye is God be with you. Perhaps that's why we only say it at the time of death. Our prayer is that God will be with our loved one as they live this life. A beautiful tale from County Waterford, collected at the turn of the 20th century and associated with St. Patrick, affirms the dignity of the human body in death. The story relates how the Lord instructed St. Patrick to visit a dying old man in a remote region who hadn't access to a priest to give him the last rites. Patrick duly visited the man's house and anointed him. The man died, though, before Patrick departed, and the saint was allowed to see the soul leave his body. However, the behaviour of the departed soul was curious. 3 times it made for the door, and then doubled back to the corpse, and on each occasion kissed the corpse tenderly. Patrick, perplexed with what he saw, later asked our Lord the reason for this. He replied, the soul was sad to leave the faithful, decent body which had kept it so clean, without sin in this life. Recently, of course, so much has changed in our lives. The present COVID-19 restrictions strike at the very heart of Irish tradition surrounding the commemoration of the dead. They deprive us of a myriad of multi-sensorial rituals, large and small, which have evolved over the course of our history as significant coping mechanisms when faced with the loss of our loved ones. Many of these traditions endure to this day, as we've seen, because they've been found to still work. And they continue to be deeply valued across the generations. In times of deep trauma, it's often rituals such as these which see us through. When I reflect on what it means to attend the evening of a funeral, I think of something like the following sequence of events. I've hinted at this earlier and said a little bit about this earlier, but just to fill out what we have been missing. Imagine arriving by car down a country road in the dusk of an evening, flagged down by neighbours of the deceased in high-vis jackets and equipped with torches, who motion you towards parking spaces near the ditch, still a good 500 metres from the house, or directed into an open field to join a myriad of other vehicles lined side by side, an extra vroom of the engine needed to make the final push. Then the tramping of feet. You're grateful there's a bit of a walk left to the house. It allows you to gather your thoughts and go over the names of key family members and relatives in your head. You hear the house before you see it. The unmistakable hum of human chatter hits your consciousness first. Most of it is coming from the yard, but there's also a nice queue of people filing down the road. You take your place in line amidst the customary "Well, and how are you going on?" "Sad old time for them," says one bespectacled lady as she cranes her neck back to you. "Cruel, cruel," offers a man leaning on a stick. "Shocking big crowd," another calls back, in something between a whisper and a bellow. "Indeed there is," comes another voice. "Sure wants to be known the whole length and breadth of the country." By the time the house comes into view, you've already well entered the rhythm of the occasion. The walk from the car has been a mini pilgrimage of sorts, a sympathizer's camino. Before you ever get to the door of the house, you notice a subtle change of chatter lines on the wind. Voices become more synchronized and rhythmic, even as some stray conversational threads weave in and out of the new sound. Nearer still to the door. "Shh," says one voice in an insistent manner. And then the communal cascade of breakneck speed again. "Oh, there, mother, I'll pray for sitting down at the hour and the bed. Oh, there, mother, I'll pray for sitting down at the hour and the bed. Oh, there, mother, I'll pray for sitting down at the hour and the bed." "Caw, caw, caw," grow some crows, almost equally in unison, from the trees on the other side of the road. The rosary has begun. That mantra that stills otherwise talkative souls at a wake, and that sweeps whole crowds up in its repetitiveness. The regularity of its cadences brings you to another stage of preparedness to meet the family and to view the deceased's body. But you're not there yet. There's still the tight squeeze through a cramped hallway, narrowly avoiding spilling a pot of tea, a plate of sandwiches, and half an apple tart, precariously held by a distant relative who weaves her way in and out of the human jam, intent on fulfilling a feeding mission to another room. "Don't go away without the tea," she calls back. And then you're finally there. You've made it. You step into that room, made sacred now by a loved one's different sort of presence. This is the funeral goer's Jerusalem and Mecca rolled into one. Your eyes are immediately drawn to the coffin, but you're already passing by the family members who stop, and you lean into the line of mourners, many standing, others sitting out of pure exhaustion or overtaken with grief. Hands extended, arms open wide. "Sorry for your troubles, sorry for your troubles. So sorry, so sorry, so sorry." And then the ones where no words are uttered and no words are necessary. Simply a silent, heartfelt embrace. The line files on. You shuffle along with it. Now you're closer to the head of the coffin, the smell of burning candles on the white cloth table. Instinctively, you pick up the sprig and you dip it in the holy water, one shake, two shakes on the coffin. You place your hands lightly in the hands of the deceased, or perhaps you sign their brow at the sign of the cross. Others will kiss those hands or that brow. All done ever so briefly. You pause momentarily, utter a silent prayer, and then you're gone. At least as far as the kitchen. "Come on in and have a cup of tea. Would you like something stronger?" Clinking of glasses, chinking of cups, hissing of kettles, buttering of scones. Voices are not hushed here. "Do you remember the time?" Someone starts at one side of the room while there are guffaws of laughter at the other side as a well-told yarn reaches its climax. Meanwhile, in the corner there's a relative who sat down with one sympathizer, relating for what must be the 100th time that day the narrative of the deceased's departure. "Well, it was last Thursday, He got up around 8:30, and he just said he wasn't feeling right. The telling and retelling of the story to a constant stream of new ears is an essential part of the process. It's repetitious, but it's her rosary. Now the sequence I've just described, one which I and so many of you have experienced many, many times over, is comprised of many discrete elements, some of which might even be considered to be mundane. And yet, taken as a whole, they work as a single fabric of social cohesion at a time of great loss. These traditions, rituals, gestures continue to be observed because they've clearly not outlived their usefulness in the process of coming to terms with the reality of death. There is a busyness about funerals, a lot of doing rather than thinking, and that somehow carries us through. Now, however, when we're cut off from so much of the familiarity of our way of doing death, when COVID-19 has shorn Irish funerals of some of their richest elements, we're in a situation of profound loss. Double loss, in fact. We've lost the person and the means by which we might ritualize the loss of that person. And yet, we have found over the last few months that even in this, with all of these restrictions, all of these challenges that have faced us, even in this we have found innovative ways, new ways, hopefully temporary ways, to express our ancient regard for those whom we love. And so to conclude, customs surrounding death have always held a fascination for me since my earliest years. As a young boy growing up in a rural village in the 1980s, tales of the interpenetration of the lives of the living and the dead, such as that related by my dear friend Nora Rice, fired my imagination and convinced me that the world was a far more mysterious place than I had previously thought. That perhaps there were lots of things about death, dying, and the afterlives, as it were, of the dead that couldn't be fully comprehended. And that somehow, even counterintuitively, the not knowing brought greater comfort than the knowing. Thank you.